want to talk to you about one of the issues that arises involving repair requests. Quite often a buyer will come into a property and finds a problem. They will then ask the seller to repair that problem before closing. The seller, in good faith, attempts to get that done by hiring a third-party contractor or vendor. It only turns out, for example, after the closing, that there is a significant problem with the work performed by that vendor. The problem occurs is that the buyer has no direct relationship with that vendor. That means the buyer has no contract with that vendor, and as a result, more often than not, cannot sue that vendor directly for the work performed for the seller. The seller, as a result, leaves themselves open to a lawsuit from the buyer for failure to perform the contract as required by law. This creates all sorts of legal issues related to merger doctrine and other issues that can result in the buyer potentially being left uncompensated for this problem, or as a result, the seller being sued and having to pay for this problem after they've already paid the vendor once, and therefore they then reach out to sue the vendor. So you have this tier of people suing each other, and that's unfortunate and could probably be avoided by a few simple tips. Let's start with the first one. We both realize, meaning the buyer and the seller, both realize that the problem in this situation is probably not the seller and probably not the buyer, but in fact the vendor. So what we want to do is create a direct relationship between the buyer and the vendor so that if the buyer has a problem with the vendor's work, the buyer doesn't have to sue the seller, they can just sue the vendor directly. And there's a simple way to do this. You require in your repair request that any contracts signed by the seller include the following language, which is about to appear on your screen. All parties acknowledge the eventual purchaser of the property is an intended third-party beneficiary of this contract. The purpose of this language is it makes sure that now, if the buyer goes to sue the vendor, the buyer can say, I was an intended third-party beneficiary. As a result, I am allowed to sue the vendor under the law for the vendor's failure to perform the contract. That one simple step can give an advantage to the buyer by allowing a direct suit, and it also gives advantage to the seller because the buyer won't be going after the seller for a problem that the seller didn't cause.